Welcome to the Debrief, Carolina Journal's weekly recap of major developments in North Carolina politics and public policy. I'm Mitch Kokai, sitting in for Donna King this time, and we have a very interesting edition of the Debrief for you this time. We're going to talk a little bit about the election news that took place both in North Carolina and across the country, some interesting developments. But we're going to spend much of this program talking about another big issue that had national attention, but also big North Carolina impact as well. That is President Donald Trump's emergency tariffs and whether they will be able to stand after going to the U.S. Supreme Court. Joining me for the discussion, we've got an expert panel. To my right, the left on your screen, Brian Balfour, who is the Senior Vice President for Research at the John Locke Foundation. And to my left, to the right on your screen, if you're looking at the wide shot, is Jeanette Doran, who is a General Counsel and also the I. Beverly Lake Jr. Fellow. Is that correct? Constitutional Fellow?
Chair of Constitutional Studies.
Chair of Constitutional Studies, even better, at the John Locke Foundation. For those who don't know, I. Beverly Lake Jr. was an esteemed state Supreme Court Chief Justice in North Carolina, and Jeanette Doran is certainly worthy of being the Chair of Constitutional Studies, named after former Chief Justice I. Beverly Lake Jr. Okay, so let's get to the program. First of all, this was Election Day for many of the people here in North Carolina and for folks across the country. Not everywhere, if you live in Raleigh, like some of us do, not any reason to go to the polls because Raleigh no longer has the odd year number elections, but certainly a number of municipalities and county governments across North Carolina had elections. Big news overall, good news for Democrats. The story, if you look at carolinajournal.com, has a headline of Democrats dominating the 2025 North Carolina municipal elections. A couple of results within that. The biggest city in North Carolina, Charlotte. Not only does Vi Lyles win a fifth term as the mayor, making her the second longest serving mayor. The longest serving mayor, Pat McCrory, back in the days when Charlotte would elect a Republican. Those days now seemingly long gone. The rest of the city council, only one Republican left. Democrats making a couple more gains, and I believe their advantage is now 11-1 on that city council, so major changes in Charlotte. Also in Wilmington, one of the other major cities, the Republicans who were left on the council are now gone. That is an all-Democratic council. And in many other parts of the state, good news for Democrats. Also noticed in Wake County, which doesn't have necessarily the same partisan spin to it, but bad news in the local elections for mayors. I believe the Morrisville mayor was the only incumbent running who won re-election. All the other incumbent mayors on the ballot in Wake County all lost. So very interesting findings. Looking beyond North Carolina, the Virginia governor's race, which often swings back and forth, did once again. Glenn Youngkin is out. Now Abigail Spanberger, former member of Congress, a Democrat, in Virginia. Democrats also win the New Jersey governor's race, and sometimes those Virginia and New Jersey races that take place in the odd year are seen as sort of a bellwether of what's to come in the midterm election. We saw in California, one of the big things that happened there, a deep blue state, the folks there decided to pass a ballot measure that would allow them to redraw their congressional map to help Democrats win more seats. And probably the big result that has people talking across the country is this New York City mayoral race, where Zohran Mamdani, who is a self-avowed Democratic socialist, is going to be the new mayor of New York City. The only person in his way at the end was former New York Governor Andrew Cuomo. But Cuomo, even with his star power in New York, was not enough to stand in the way of a Democratic socialist being the new mayor of New York City. Brian, given what we've seen about this is probably going to be kind of an interesting experiment in government, now having a self-avowed Democratic socialist at the helm in New York. What do you expect to see as we watch in the coming months and years?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, a lot of buzz around that election result, obviously. And as I like to say, it's hard to compete with Santa Claus, right? I mean, he campaigned on giving everyone free stuff, or most of the people free stuff in the city, but as we all know, there is no such thing as a free lunch, so it's got to be paid for by somebody. And of course, the promises, as it usually begins, is that they're just going to tax the quote-unquote rich and the corporations to pay for all these free programs. But the rich and corporations, they're not stationary targets. They're not necessarily going to just sit and then just pay whatever tax rate is laid on them. So we may see an exodus of a lot of the high income earners out of New York City, some of the businesses, corporations moving out of there to move to locations where their capital is more welcome and they're not taxed. And so as that specific part of the tax base erodes, then who are they going to tax to pay for the billions and billions of dollars that it's going to cost to fund for all these programs? So New York City, I mean, be careful what you wish for. So we'll see how this plays out and how much of his promises he really backs up and tries to deliver on.
Yeah, and there were some people who thought that maybe he would sort of be very gracious when he won and talk about everyone needing to unite, and his speech was very fiery. And even some people who were probably supporters of him said, wait a minute, this sounds a little bit more than what we bargained for, so it'll be very interesting to watch. Though that was the 2025 election result, we are also just weeks away from candidate filing for the 2026 elections in North Carolina. No governor's race on the ballot, but we do have a big open U.S. Senate seat. Tom Tillis not running for re-election. Right now the front runners to run for that seat, on the Democratic side, former Governor Roy Cooper. On the Republican side, former Republican National Committee Chairman Michael Whatley. There are some other people who will be running, but those are the two biggest names that we see so far. Also, all of the congressional seats, every seat in the legislature up for discussion. And Jeanette, I know you're very interested in some other races that are on the ballot that are statewide races that have a major impact. One, a seat on the state Supreme Court, and 3 seats on the North Carolina Court of Appeals. Why should we be watching this?
Well, we need to keep in mind that we're unique in that our statewide, our judicial races for Court of Appeals and Supreme Court are statewide and they're partisan. Our Supreme Court has only 7 members. We've got, at this point, a 5-2 Republican-Democrat split. One of the Democrats, Justice Anita Earls, she's up for re-election.
And she's the only one.
And she is the only one on the Supreme Court. So whether she is re-elected or a Republican is elected in her stead won't make a huge shift, but it could mean that Republicans would maintain a control for an even longer period of time, because then we would be looking at a 6-1 split if you're talking about just a partisan divide. Of course, it's important to remember that a great many of our cases at the state Supreme Court are not political in the sense that people would necessarily assume that they'd fall on a partisan divide. But we also elect all of our Court of Appeals judges on a statewide basis, and we have 3 Democrats on the court now, and they are all up for re-election next year. So it'll be interesting to see where voters weigh in on that partisan factor at the courts.
Yeah, very interesting. The seats on the State Court of Appeals and with the North Carolina Supreme Court, 8-year terms.
Yes.
And we are coming up on the end of a cycle that was very good for the Democrats. They won that Anita Earls seat and all 3 of those seats on the Court of Appeals. And now all of them are up for grabs again at the end of the 8-year cycle.
That was really the last good cycle for Democrats in North Carolina judicial races, because between that cycle and what we have had experience with last year's pretty contentious Supreme Court race, Republicans were just win after win after win after win. So now's the time to see whether Democrats are going to make a significant dent in that, or whether last year's Supreme Court race where we elected a Democrat, was that an outlier to the general trend of North Carolinians preferring Republican judges? We'll see.
That's going to be very interesting, and you will be hearing on the debrief quite a bit about the 2026 elections, probably between now and the actual election itself. So stay tuned, a year's worth of information about that. It's a good reminder that if you are interested in what we're talking about, would like to comment, like, subscribe, do all of the things that you do on social media. And if you have any ideas about things that you'd like for us to discuss on the debrief, please be sure to let us know in the comments. We would love to hear from you. Now let's shift gears to the big story outside of elections that took place nationally but has a definite North Carolina impact, and that is Donald Trump and his emergency tariffs heading to the U.S. Supreme Court, where the court was trying to deal with this issue of whether the president had the authority for the tariffs. Before we get into the legal and constitutional arguments, I want to turn back to Brian. The John Locke Foundation is a free market group. We don't like tariffs from a policy perspective. Remind us, what do we have against tariffs? Why are they bad?
Sure. Well, I mean, first and foremost, you mentioned a free market. That's what we believe in. We believe that we should have the freedom to choose how to spend our money. And if that involves buying from producers that are domestic or from overseas, we should have the freedom to do that. It's our money, we've earned it, and it's a mutually beneficial exchange when we purchase products from businesses wherever they are. So we should have the freedom to do so. But secondarily, beyond that, it's just bad economics, and it's bad economics for Americans. I mean, we're sold that this is supposed to reshore manufacturing jobs, reignite the manufacturing sector in America. But if you look at the data this year, especially since the big Liberation Day announcement of all the tariffs that kind of kicked all of this off, manufacturing activity has declined. I believe I just saw for 8 consecutive months now. Manufacturing jobs have been continuing to fall all throughout the year. So the one stated benefit that we're supposed to receive from these tariffs has been failing. We've been failing on that count. So what happens when tariffs are implemented? That makes imported goods more expensive for consumers, right? So that hurts household budgets. We're either having to spend more on the imports if they're able to still get into the country over the import barriers, which makes household budgets a little tighter. Or those options, or the foreign manufacturers, they decide not to import into America at all, which takes away those more affordable options for household consumers, so which again makes us worse off. I mean, you don't make the American people, especially consumers and households, you don't make them better off by taking away affordable options for goods and products that they need and want to satisfy their needs.
Yeah, so that is the basic policy argument. We may get more into that because one of the interesting things is that the John Locke Foundation took place in a brief, and I really enjoyed one of the pieces in there talking about trade deficits. So I may get back to you on that. But this is, as we mentioned before, a big week for Donald Trump's tariffs because 2 different cases were consolidated at the U.S. Supreme Court to deal with legal and constitutional challenges to those tariffs. And before we talk about what the Supreme Court had to say, Jeanette watched and listened to all of it for almost 3 hours. But before we get to that, the John Locke Foundation actually played a role in this case as well by filing an amicus or friend of the court brief along with the Goldwater Institute. Tell us about that brief and what it was arguing.
So there were multiple facets to it, and really to understand the role that our amicus brief played, you need to kind of get a macro sense of what the case was about. So fundamentally, the question is whether the president had the authority to impose these, limitless worldwide tariffs. And he pointed to a statute, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEPA. And he said, I'm allowed to do it. Yes, from 1976. And he said, Congress gave me the authority to do this. So our brief, along with Goldwater and others, argued, one, you can't do that because there's no emergency, and IEPA requires that the president declare an emergency. So this is not an emergency. We've had deficits for decades. That's not an emergency. And the drug trafficking, that's gone on for years. That's not an emergency sufficient to trigger IEPA.
And those were his two justifications,
Those were
drug
his-
smuggling and trade deficits.
Yes, because there were fundamentally two groups of tariffs. One are called the trafficking tariffs. Those were imposed as against imports from China and then Canada and Mexico. And then the reciprocal tariffs, which were basically worldwide. So the question is, was there an emergency sufficient to trigger IEPA? And then we got into the questions of, well, does IEPA even authorize tariffs? Because that statute doesn't mention tariffs. And there are tariffs mentioned all throughout the United States Code, which is the body of federal statutes. But it's nowhere in IEPA. So how could Congress have given the president vast tariff authority by not even mentioning the word tariff? And then there are the questions of, well, even if Congress had done that, could it constitutionally do that? Because the Constitution gives to Congress the power to impose taxes, duties, imports, and also the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations. So there's a multi-layered analysis at play, and that's where we participated.
Yeah, so you sort of gave the basic civics lesson, but to remind people, tariffs, there's nothing illegal. It's a bad policy idea from our perspective, but there's nothing illegal about having a tariff if it's done in the right way. But the right way would be Congress decides there's going to be a tariff, they pass a bill, President signs or goes over a veto, and you go through the normal process. What President Trump had done was say, there's an emergency because this IEPA bill gives me powers in an emergency. I'm going to say this emergency gives me the power to have tariffs, and that's what we're talking about.
And it's, it really needs to be noted that in the 50 years that statute has been around, no president has used it to impose tariffs like this. I mean, Trump didn't in his first term, and these things he's complaining of, trade deficits and the fentanyl crisis, they aren't new. They existed in his first administration. They existed in varying degrees under other administrations, and no other president has thought that he could exploit or pervert IEPA the way that Donald Trump is now.
And we're going to get back to you on what the U.S. Supreme Court had to say about it, because you, thankfully, so we didn't have to, you actually listened to the whole thing. But I want to get back to Brian first on, we mentioned trade deficits, and I noticed in reading the well-written Locke brief that it did have a really good description of why trade deficits in and of themselves are not even a problem. That this is something that's been kind of a misnomer, that trade deficits are a bad thing. But we've been dealing with trade deficits for 50 years in good economic times and bad economic times. It doesn't seem to be the case that a trade deficit is necessarily bad.
Correct. Yeah, absolutely right. And the whole notion of this kind of worry about what a trade deficit is basically, more money is leaving your country via consumers relative to the amount of money coming in based on exports. And this goes back to, hundreds of years ago. Adam Smith, 250 years ago, wrote The Wealth of Nations, and a big part of that book was addressing this notion that they called mercantilism at the time, where countries were concerned. At that time, gold was money, so they were concerned about gold leaving their country, even though they were acquiring goods in exchange for the gold. But all they focused on was that gold, that money is leaving our country, so this must be bad. But of course, Smith really dismantled that entire argument. Trade deficits, it's certainly not an emergency. It's in most cases, it's not even necessarily nothing to be concerned about. Sometimes we can have a look at, well, what are other countries doing with the money that they receive when Americans purchase products from overseas companies. And what typically happens is that money is either going to end up buying goods from American producers, or investing in America, foreign direct investment that returns back to America. So it's not just a static, a relationship with that money. Once that money leaves, then it's just, oh my gosh, we just have less money and we're less less rich or less wealthy because the money is left. There's subsequent a subsequent process that what happens, and it's not negative at all, and often it bounces back to benefit America and America jobs and businesses as well.
This is a dated reference, but sometimes this seems to me like a case of people having the Scrooge McDuck economic perspective, where the character, the duck cartoon character who's like Ebenezer Scrooge, gets this money and he sticks it in his mattress or in a room, and it sits there and it never goes away, and he swims in the dollar bills. That's not how it works. Right. If you buy the money, it's going to come back to buy other things, sometimes goods from us, sometimes services. But trade deficits in and of themselves, not a problem, as was well spelled out in the Locke and Goldwater brief. Okay.
Well, and I'd like to drive home that point, and I'm glad you mentioned services. In a lot of these discussions, we're not accounting for the difference between products and services. A significant part of the U.S. economy is the provision of services.
And Trump's focusing on goods.
Exactly. But especially here in North Carolina, we have a lot of services, research and development, tech services. Those are significant services that don't get factored into these discussions about deficits, which are all product focusing. And that is a point made in the brief.
Yeah, very good. Speaking of the brief was in front of the justices along with many other briefs. Seems like everyone wanted to weigh in on this case. And the justices, in addition to reading all those briefs, also listened for nearly 3 hours as the two cases were in front of them. You were paying attention to the whole thing. What was your big takeaway?
It was a law geek dream day, is my big takeaway. I think, and I've always thought it was very dangerous to predict an outcome based on the questioning of the justices. It will be some time before we get a decision, but I think it's fairly clear that there's a lot of concern among the justices about this, what Gorsuch described as a one-way ratchet of executive power. If the court were to adopt and greenlight Trump's interpretation, there would really be no way to get that power back. And then what does that say of our checks and balances and our separation of powers? So we had a lot of skepticism on that. We had a lot of commentary, and this should please English teachers across the country, a lot of discussion about which verbs in the statute were broad and which were not, and whether a word was being used as a verb or a noun. My sister's a retired teacher, and I'm sure she loved that portion of the argument when I sent her a clip. But it was a very interesting argument in that you had different clusters of justices really drilling in. Again, Justice Barrett very closely tied to the specific wording of the statute. Justice Gorsuch very concerned with kind of the meta questions of not just this case, but what are we saying about the scope of executive power in general. At one point he asked, could Congress even abdicate or delegate to the president the power to declare war? Could they just decide they were tired of all this lawmaking?
Don't give President Trump that idea.
Well, it was funny. General Sauer, Solicitor General of the United States, who represented the administration, was very quick to say, well, we're not saying it does that. And Gorsuch said, but where is the line? And where do we draw the line? And of course, the so-called liberal wing of the court, they were very aggressive in their questioning, had lots of concerns on multiple areas. And then we had Justice Alito and Justice Thomas, who seemed to be the most sympathetic to the Trump administration. And Justice Kavanaugh brought up what he has described, or others have described, as the donut hole, because IEPA would allow it explicitly would allow the president to halt imports. So Kavanaugh, and it was subsequently picked up a little bit by Justice Barrett, Justice Kavanaugh was, well, it seems kind of odd that Congress would give the president the power to halt all the imports, but not the power to impose a tariff. Doesn't that seem like something of a donut hole? And there'll be an interesting series of opinions. I think it's safe to bet this is not going to be a unanimous decision.
And probably not one that's written in 10, 15 pages. This will be a book.
It'll be a doozy. There'll be several of them, and I think it's also safe to say I'm sure a lot of your viewers may have followed the TikTok case from about 10, 11 months ago. Supreme Court fast-tracked it and handed down its decision a week later. I don't think we're going to get that kind of turnaround because the issues are so much broader. But I also don't think that this is a case that will be pushed to late June or July for release.
It'll be very interesting, and we'll be following the results on that as we move forward. Our time is running short, but another thing that I want to mention that also has a tie into the legal community is, since we last spoke to you on the debrief, a major loss to the North Carolina policy and legal community in the death of Gene Boyce, who was a big supporter of the Locke Foundation. If you go to carolinajournal.com, you can see a column that's posted on Thursday from Donna King about Gene Boyce's legacy. Jeanette, you also knew Gene and had a chance to write earlier this week at carolinajournal.com. Just briefly, your thoughts about what the significance is of Gene's passing.
It is a great loss to North Carolina. It is a great loss to the tradition of those like Gene, Papa Gene, as he was known, who believed in fighting for what was right and fighting for the Constitution, whether it was going to turn out favoring your guys, your side, or favoring the other side. The law was the law, the Constitution's the Constitution, and he fought that fight every day, and he did it with honor and integrity.
And if you know him for nothing else, you should know Gene Boyce for the fact that he was the one, if you are familiar with U.S. political history, it was his questioning from his work on the Senate Watergate Committee that revealed that former President Richard Nixon had a taping system in the White House, and that revelation helped lead ultimately to the end of the Nixon presidency. So Gene Boyce, not just a big person in North Carolina, but also nationally. Some might not know his name, but they should, because he played a significant role in one of the major developments in our, at least in my lifetime, I know in Brian's lifetime, maybe not yours, in our lifetimes, of things that happen in the world of politics and public policy. That's all the time that we have for this week's edition of The Debrief. We thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe, comment, tell us what you'd like to see. We'll be back again next week with another edition. Thanks for watching.